Welcome to Salford, near where the stage is set for the Tory party conference and where our studio is set for our interview with the Prime Minister, eager to win back your support.
Will HS2 ever reach Manchester, Prime Minister?
Can he? Will he? Rishi Sunak hopes this get-together in Manchester will put a rocket under his rebrand, sticking the brakes on some plans for the environment, promising more change to come.
We are going to make different decisions. We won't take the easy way out. There will be resistance, but we will meet it.
But can this serious Sunak, who vowed calm after chaos, win the Tories a historic fifth term? The polls suggest not. And some of his colleagues seem to revel in making trouble.
Multiculturalism makes no demands of the incomer to integrate. It has failed.
Labour says its team is on the march to number 10.
We work night and day to change this party, to make sure the Labour Party faces the voters, not itself, has a positive message, change for the better.
So we have one big question this morning. How does Rishi Sunak plan to get back your support? Live to take our questions, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister himself. Wes Streeting, one of Labour's team trying to shove him out of office, is here too. And what's it like to play a Prime Minister? Megastar of stage and screen, Dame Helen Mirren, tells us exclusively about her latest film, Golda.
My father would hide us in the cellar, and we'd stay silent, hoping the killers would pass us by. I'm not that little girl hiding in the cellar.
Morning from the BBC in Salford, where helping us pick through the news and the Prime Minister's interview, Fraser Nelson, the editor of the Tory Bible, The Spectator magazine, Baroness Louise Casey, former government advisor and now in the House of Lords, and John Coleshaw, actor and impressionist, who will be his target today. First of all, let's take a look at what's making the news. Many of the newspapers lead on government announcements as the Tories warm up for their conference. The Sunday Express has a £1 billion lifeline for derelict high streets. The Sunday Telegraph says the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, might send UK troops to Ukraine. And the Sunday Times has a different story, an interview with Kemi Badenoch, the Trade Secretary, piling pressure on Rishi Sunak to quit the European Court of Human Rights. But the Observer says an education minister has been keeping secret files on critics of their schools policy. But the Independent claims the Tories are headed for an election wipeout, according to a top pollster. And I suppose, Fraser, that's really the question that hangs over this conference, doesn't it? Rishi Sunak's trying to rebrand himself against a long period of being in the doldrums.
He's trying to make this conference what redefine him, from being a guy who was managerialist, quite boring in the first year, to being more radical and slaying various dragons in his second year. Now, there's an opinion poll out today showing the Tory deficit is down to 10 points. Now, it was 20 points not so long ago, so that will buoy the Tories. There will be a blip, this poll, but if you can get to 10 points behind by Christmas, then that takes you into territory where they might just scrape it next year.
Louise, how big do you think the scale of the challenge is? You've advised Labour and Conservative governments, and we should say you're backing Labour now, but how big is the scale of the policy challenge, the problems of the country?
Well, I mean, I think the key thing for me, whether it's Labour or the Conservatives, is that they have to grip the huge problems that, in fact, were made so significantly worse by the pandemic. The number of people using food banks, the number of people homeless, the sort of real fissures in our communities and societies, which we need long-term solutions to and not quick fixes. So that's what I'll be looking for.
John, what about you? I mean, I know you follow politics closely, even though you're an impressionist, an actor, an entertainer. But what kind of thing would you like to hear from Rishi Sunak?
Well, I don't know, just a sense. It's good to see the Prime Minister doing an interview. In the past, he's not really done as many as other politicians and Prime Ministers. A little bit of invisibility, so an interview is at least welcome and good research for me. And
what about you, the kind of things we've heard in the last couple of days? He's talked about a war on motorists. He's been talking about slowing down some environmental commitments.
Yes, well, I suppose the war on motorists, the Uxbridge by-election with the reaction to the Ulay zone, that's a sort of a vote-winning area, so push against that. Maybe there's a key thing.
OK, well, let's get on with it. We'll be back with you three shortly in the programme. Now, the main event this time last year, Rishi Sunak might have felt like putting his feet up after losing the Tory leadership to Liz Truss. But just weeks later, he had his nose to the grindstone, moving into number 10 to placate the markets and try to calm down the public. He's here now, and as John was saying, we're delighted to have you here for a live interview. So let's find out what kind of Prime Minister you really want to be. You've come out as a big supporter of drivers, talking about the war on motorists. Now, we've had a look at some of the people who are fighting what you call that war. One of them is in Cornwall, where the council is proposing a speed limit of 20 miles an hour, the kind you say is anti-British. But they're a Conservative council. Are they fighting a war against motorists?
Well, good morning, Laura. Fantastic to be with you. And when it comes to this point around driving, you know, what occurred to me as I was going around the country talking to people, that there just seemed to be this sense that lots of people wanted to stop making life easy for people to use their cars. And I don't think that was right. Cars, for most people, are the form of transport that they rely on the most. It's a freedom that it gives you. It's the ability to just get around and do your day-to-day life. And for too many people, it felt like everyone was trying to stop them doing that, imposing on them blanket speed restrictions. That's what we've seen in Wales from the Labour government there, blanket 20 mile an hour.
We've had a close look at what's happening in Wales, and it's very similar to what this Conservative council in Cornwall is proposing. And also even in your own part of the world, in North Yorkshire, there are, I think, more than 100 parish councils who want to have a 20 mile an hour limit. So if you think it's the wrong thing, as you've explained, will you stop Conservative councils bringing in these plans?
Yeah, this is about local people being in the driving seat, and it's about making sure that things are not imposed on local communities without their consent. Now, of course, it makes sense to have speed limits around, for example, school areas. Everyone wants safety for our children, but these things need to be done with consent, and it can't be part of this war on motorists. And that's why, for example, when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by record amounts to help people with the cost of living, because, again, cars are important. It's why we've seen, actually, again, you were talking about ULEZ earlier, this idea that ordinary families should be forced to pay £12.50 just to take their kids to school, to do the weekly shop. You know, all of these things don't strike me as being right for our country. And it's right that we reset the balance here and respect and recognise that people do rely on their cars.
But I'd like to be really clear about what you're actually proposing here. So our viewers will have heard you express sympathy for people who think driving's pretty tough these days. But I want to be really clear about what you're actually proposing. Will you stop councils, whether they're Conservative, Labour or any colour of the rainbow, will you stop them introducing 20 mile an hour zones as a default? Because that's really what's at stake here. You can complain about it, as lots of our viewers might do, but are you going to stop it happening? Because if you don't, then it's just rhetoric, isn't it?
No, what this is about is making sure that the statutory guidance that goes to local councils from government is clear about making sure that councils, which are obviously in charge of what's happening in their local areas, are doing things with the support and consent of their local communities,
but if they
taking
have
into account the needs of their communities,
but if they have
and
that,
not
then
imposing
they can
things on them without their consent.
But if they have that, they can crack on.
What I don't want to do is, the Transport Secretary is going to set out the detail of this in his speech later on.
But hang on, you've been talking about this for the last few days.
Yes,
you're trying to make a big pitch on this. I want to be really clear. What you've just said is if local councils who are democratically elected, if they want to do it, they should be allowed to do it.
Yeah, what they should be allowed to do in all cases is act in accordance with the government guidance. And that's what we're going to bring forward, is making sure that the guidance to councils about how these things are done is done with regard to the needs and wants of local communities. And what we've seen in Labour-run Wales, a blanket imposition of a 20 mile an hour speed limit.
What you're
and what you've seen are hundreds of thousands of people have risen up against that and signed a petition. And that gives you a sense of the strength of feeling on this issue. And I want people to know that we are on their side.
But what you have said is if local communities and local councils who are democratically elected want to do it, they can do it. And that is an important point, because I think some of this in the last few days, people might think, you know, your love for motorists seems to have come to you in the Conservative Party quite recently. You know, it was a Conservative government that told cities all over the country to bring in clean air zones, which was tough for the drivers of older vehicles. It was a Conservative mayor who first introduced and announced the low emission zone in London. Conservative councils have been introducing 20 mile an hour zones. And, you know, a sceptic might just wonder if your newfound passion for this agenda comes from the fact that you've been in the doldrums in the polls for a long time, and yet you hung on in Uxbridge, in the London suburb, by campaigning against the low emission zone that your party put forward as a plan. That's what's happening here, isn't it?
I guess the bit that you failed to mention, Laura, that when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by a record amount. So
as previous Chancellors did before you,
I cut
with
it.
long-running
What
campaigns.
previous Chancellors did was freeze fuel duty. What I did was cut it by the largest amount, pretty much on record. That saves drivers £100 a year over the past year. I did that a long time ago. And you talked about ULEZ. Now, all I'd say is, when it came to charting a new course on net zero, which I set out the other day, I set out a way to get there more pragmatic, more proportionate, more realistic, and that will save families £5, 10, 15, £20,000.
Well, those figures are a bit disputed about who will save how much just when.
If I could just finish the point.
Of course.
Now, I charted out that new course on net zero. That wasn't some knee-jerk reaction to the Uxbridge by-election. I, for a long time, have had concerns about the costs that were being asked of working families when it came to meeting these net zero targets. And I came to the view that we could meet what are world-leading targets, by the way, because we're doing more than anyone else, but we could do it in a more pragmatic and realistic way that saves people costs, not unnecessarily having to switch their cars, replace their boilers, particularly in rural areas. That's what I did. Look, I get that there'll be criticism of that decision. I'm fine with it because I think it's the right long-term decision for our country.
But that's interesting because you say you had these concerns about the costs that the net zero targets were imposing for a long time. Now, you were at the cabinet table busily supporting Boris Johnson's net zero targets. Is it the case that you disagreed with him privately and you were raising these concerns? Or have you only just realised how serious the costs might potentially have been? Which is it?
I've raised these concerns in the past, but I've been Prime Minister for less than a year, and now I'm the one responsible for it.
But so when you were Chancellor, you were unhappy about the targets?
Of course, I raised concerns at the time about the costs that were going to be put on families. And one of the points I made the other week is when we debate these things in Parliament, what I'd like to see next time around, when we set a carbon budget in Parliament that says this is how we're going to reduce carbon emissions, at the same time, the country should also be considering all the things that are required to meet that budget. That seems to me to be the sensible way to do this. What I don't like is the way that we've done this in the past, because it's not being honest with people. That's not the kind of leadership that I want to bring. I want to do things differently, because if we want to change our country, we have to approach politics differently. And this is an example of it.
But
it's me being upfront about what's required, saying that these are the costs that were being put on people. I don't agree with them. I think we can still get there without them. I'm confident of that. We're not walking away from any of our targets,
can you be
which are
honest about
world-leading.
this, though?
And that, I think, is actually a position that will command the broad support of the British people.
But can you be honest about this, though? Is that by slowing down the pace of hitting the net zero target, which you've explained that you wanted to do and you had concerns about some time, pretty much every single environmental expert, including lots of Conservatives who care passionately about this, say the obvious logic here is that you are slowing down the UK's progress to hitting its climate targets, and that is a short-term political calculation because you've had heat from the right in your party about the green agenda. Rightly or wrongly, can you be honest with everybody watching this morning and say, sure, politics is part of it, because you were worried about it being unpopular?
Absolutely not, because I'm focused on doing what I believe is right for the country in the long term. I've had these concerns for a long time. Here are the facts. Let's just go over the facts of what you said. We've already decarbonised faster than any other major G7 economy. That's a fact. We all have a set of targets for how much we're going to decarbonise by 2030. Again, who's the best? We are, down 68%.
It's not really a reason to give up something because you're good at it, is it?
No, hang on. We are going to meet these targets while we're decarbonising faster than everybody else, faster than Europe,
and there are
America,
plenty of
Australia,
analysts, including
Canada, Japan.
the independent watchdog on this, says that actually we're likely to be off track.
Laura, if I could just finish, because it's really important. We are not off track. We are not off track. All these other countries are behind us. We're ahead of them. We're going to continue to be ahead of them. We have an obligation to meet these targets. We will meet them. That's what all our analysis says. But we can do so in a more proportionate, pragmatic way that saves families thousands of pounds. Now, for all the critics, which you are right, there are critics of what we're doing. The question for them is, why do they think it's right to impose costs of £5, 10, 15, £20,000 on families to do something that we don't think is necessary to meet world-leading net zero targets? It's fine to criticise me, it's fine to disagree, but then you have to explain to families why you think it's right to impose those costs on them. I don't think it is, and that's why we're charting a new course. And that's an example of doing things differently and doing the right thing for the country in the long term.
Well, let's talk about another long-term decision, and I'm glad you mentioned tracks there, because there's a seamless move on to talk about the railways. We are sitting in Salford, right next to Manchester. Yes or no? Will HS2, high-speed rail, come to this part of the world?
There's already spades in the ground on HS2 and we're getting on with delivering it.
It's not my question. Yes or no, is it coming here?
I'm not going to comment on all this speculation. We've got a project, we've got spades in the ground and we're getting on with it. But it's right to focus on levelling up. Because
Can I just stop you there? You were the Prime Minister of this country. This is not asking you about speculation. You're not a columnist. You're not a backbencher with an axe to grind. You're not someone from the rail industry. You are the Prime Minister of this country. This is your decision. Is this going to happen or not?
As I said, we've got spades in the ground. I'm not going to comment on further speculation, but what I can tell you we are doing is absolutely committed to levelling up across this country. Just today, we've announced a new plan to put a long-term plan, actually, to focus on people in towns. More people live in towns and live in big cities in our country, and they don't get the attention that they deserve. And my view is that we need to focus on the long-term things that will make our towns better places to live, put local people in control, and that's why we're backing them with £1 billion of funding to help 55 towns across the country, to help them level up, better high streets, more security, less homelessness, in making sure that they protect civic assets, and they're going to be given long-term endowment funding, £20 million per town, empowering local people, putting them in charge of those decisions to help support them. That's an example of levelling up in action that this Conservative government is delivering today.
Might be pleased to hear about that this morning. But you say there again you are committed to long-term decisions, and yet you are visibly refusing to make a long-term decision at this stage about HS2. You've even got it branded on your slogan at the conference, long-term decisions for a brighter future, and yet you won't tell people the decision on HS2. And it's not just about your political critics picking you up on this, it's also people in your own party. Businesses are alarmed by your wobbling on this decision. Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, a Conservative, says the wobbling over HS2 risks making the UK look a laughingstock.
I'd completely reject that. I speak to business leaders all the time. I've just been around the world. I've recently been in Japan, in America, in Europe. We're attracting billions of pounds of investment into this country, creating jobs everywhere. You talk about levelling up. Because of Brexit, we've created free ports in places like Teesside, where there's record investment coming in, supporting the industries of the future.
But I know you care deeply about the views of business. Because we've left the EU, we can now sign trade deals with the fastest growing parts of the world, like Asia. This is what we're doing. That's what I hear from business leaders around the world. They're excited about the opportunities that investing in Britain offers. But you know well that there has been concern over changing the goalposts on net zero and on the HS2 wobble on the decision whenever we're going to get it. Changing your mind may be the right thing to do, but it has a cost. I'd just like to play our viewers and play you a clip.
It's become clear to me over recent months that the Conservative Party are drifting out of touch with the needs of business, of the environment, and also the everyday people that my business touches and serves.
Now, that's Richard Walker. I know some of your colleagues will say he's grumpy because he wanted to be a Conservative MP and hasn't found a seat to run in, but he's the boss of Iceland, which is a big, important company in this country. He's hacked off. You've got former Prime Ministers hacked off over your wobble on HS2. You've got a big group of Tory MPs rattling your cage demanding tax cuts. You've even got Michael Gove, your close colleague this morning, saying there should be tax cuts before the general election. With your changes of heart, have you really got your party under control?
So, look, with Richard, as you said, I think he was trying to stand as a Conservative candidate, but he talked about net zero. He talked about making sure that we're prioritising working people. That's the decision I've made.
But my question is the impact of spooking people by changing your mind.
No. I'm sorry. Yes, change may be uncomfortable for people. People may be critical of it, but I believe I'm doing the right thing for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. If I believe the right thing to do is to chart a new course to net zero that will save ordinary families £5, 10, 15, £20,000, I'm going to do it. And whether it's him, whether it's anyone else who wants to be critical of that decision, I'm okay with that. They should be the ones that explain why they think it is right to put those costs on people. It might be fine for them to afford it. It's not fine for everyone else. I don't think it's right.
And
when it comes to taxes, look, I'm a Conservative. Of course I want to cut taxes. The best tax cut that I can deliver for the British people right now is to halve inflation.
Well,
that was why it was the first of my priorities.
It's a feature in the economy. But I want to
Laura,
ask you about Michael Gove's comments this morning.
I think actually, no, if I could, please, because it's really important, because you just said something that I completely disagree with. Inflation is a tax. You just said it isn't. Inflation is a tax. It's a tax that impacts the poorest people the most. And that is why the best tax cut that I can deliver is to halve inflation.
Well,
and that's why I set it out as the first.
Let's not have an
economically, the
debate.
impact that it has on people is
But
to eat into their pockets, it eats into their wallets, it puts up the prices of things, it effectively acts as a tax. And that is why we must bring it down, and that's why we are, and the plans are working.
But my question to you, Prime Minister, this morning is about the impact of the changes that you have been making. And you're explaining that you think they're the right things to do, and you're basically saying, bring it on to your critics. But on the one specific, your close colleague, Michael Gove, this morning has said that you should commit to cutting taxes for working people before the next election. Will you make that commitment?
Now, as I said, the best tax cut that we can give working people is to halve inflation.
So you won't make that commitment right now?
I'm a Conservative. I want to cut taxes. Yeah. But people saw very clearly. You asked me about making changes. Change may be difficult, but I believe the country wants change, and I'm going to do things differently to bring about that change. And you saw that last summer when it came to this question. I said the most important priority we face was to bring inflation down. It's inflation that's putting the prices of things up.
And you've made
inflation that's making people feel poorer. The quicker we bring inflation down, the better it is. And that's why it's the right priority. And we are making good progress. And you can start to see in the last few months, the numbers are coming down. We've got to stick to the plan because I know things are tough and there is work to do.
And you've made that point. Who voted for the programme you're now putting forward?
Well, look, I'm here putting forward a programme that I believe is right for the country. When I got this job, wasn't the easiest of circumstances, as you alluded to in your opening, and my first priority was bring immediate relief to people, support with the cost of living, which we've done with energy bills, put a plan in place to stop the boats, and I'm pleased that this year, for the first time since the small boats phenomenon arose, that the numbers of people crossing are down by a fifth, so we are making progress. But now what I want to do is show the country how we're going to change things for the better in the long term. And that means doing things differently, making decisions that will make a difference to people's lives, even if I get criticism for them. That's what the net zero decision was about, and that's how I plan to lead.
But it's interesting because when the public, I think, looks at all of this, sometimes they wonder, you know, this time last year we asked Liz Truss who had voted for her programme, which of course imploded. And the answer then was, I think, around 80,000 Tory party members. You didn't go through a leadership contest. So no one factually voted for the changes that you are now making. And I just wonder if are you relaxed about that?
Yeah, because I'm doing what I believe is right. I did that last summer. I stood up for my principles. I said what I thought was right for the country, and that was that fighting inflation was a priority, and you can't borrow your way out of doing that. I stuck to my guns, and I'm always going to do what I believe is right for the country, and that's what I'm doing now.
But in terms of what the public voted for, so much of the 2019 manifesto that you stood on has just disappeared. You know, you're wobbling on HS2, you've changed the net zero targets, the long-term plan for social care is not happening. Your health secretary admitted to us a few weeks ago that 40 new hospitals aren't all going to be new hospitals after all. You know, your allies are saying now people are going to see the real Rishi Sunak in this second phase. But is the real Rishi Sunak someone who's willing to chuck much of the 2019 manifesto over the side when you've been behind in the polls?
You're saying things that are just not true, saying we chuck net zero targets, but that's just not true.
I said
we're committed to our net zero targets. We haven't shifted them. They remain exactly the same. They're legislated for. How we get there is always a matter of government policy. The targets are the same. It's wrong to suggest that the targets have been changed. They haven't. It's wrong to suggest that they've been watered down. They haven't. They're set in law.
But the dates of how you get there have shifted.
But there are lots. There are over 100 different policies to help us get to net zero. They weren't all in the 2019 manifesto. The government constantly has a programme of figuring out what the right way to get there is. I've charted a different way to get to the same destination. One that will save families £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, I think is right. But you asked your fundamental question.
But yeah, the fundamental question is
that I'm doing what I believe is right for the long term of our country. I'm prepared to change things. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do what I believe is right. I get that people will be critical of that. I'm okay with that. I'm going to be guided by what I believe is right. I believe that what I'm doing is right for the British people, whether it's a new course on net zero, which will save them money, whether it's putting in place legislation that will enable us to stop the boats, because it should be the British people that decide who comes to our country and not criminal gangs. These are the types of decisions that I'm going to put in place because I believe they're right.
And we're hearing loud and clear that you might keep changing things. There might be more to come if you think that's the right thing, even though they're not things that the public voted for at the last election.
Look, I have a good sense of what the British people's priorities are. I'm going to set about delivering for them, and that's a change that I'm going to bring. I do want to change things. I'm absolutely here to change our country for the better. I believe that means you have to do politics differently, and that's what you saw on Net Zero, that's what you've seen from me before, and that's what you're going to keep seeing from me going forward, because I can lead this country in a different way and ensure that we get our country on a path to a brighter future. That's what this conference is going to be about, and that's what my leadership is about.
And you mentioned there you feel you've got a good sense of where the public's at. Let's look at what the public associates with you and we ask them. Now, we did this with Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader. We'll do it again with Keir Starmer. We're using what's called a word cloud, asking people what they associate a leader with, and we can show our viewers that with this morning. Now, you can see there, rightly or wrongly, what many people associate with you is your personal wealth. What does that make you think? Does that worry you if people might feel you're out of touch? Or perhaps, you know, you are very wealthy. You could be living on a beach, not working at all. You know, a lot of people might think, well, you've got all this wealth, you could do anything, good on you for being in public service. But what goes through your mind when you see that?
Look, my job is to deliver for people. And that's why we've just been talking a lot about this net zero decision, which I've made.
I think people would really like to know what your response is. We've talked about the net zero target a lot.
But this is a great example of it. You know, that is a decision which was motivated by me wanting to ease the burden on families. And again, I might get lots of criticism from people about that, people who could happily afford to rip out their boiler, install incredibly expensive energy efficiency upgrades in their rural home that's off the gas grid, or change their car sooner than is necessary. It might be fine for them to do all those things. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's necessary. I want to save families that £5, £10, £15, £20,000. That's why I made the decision I did.
Again, I want to remind our viewers that those figures are disputed, but you clearly feel good about what you're doing.
You keep saying they're disputed. I mean, literally, you can go online. If you live on an off-gas good property that currently doesn't have an EPC rating that it was legislated to meant to get to, and then go and ask someone, how much does it cost to upgrade the energy efficiency of that home and put in a heat pump in it, you would come back and they'd say £20,000. It's not a made-up figure, that's fact.
I'm not saying they're made up, but the scale of how many families this would actually affect is something that is not entirely as has been presented.
That would have been impacted by these things, and that wasn't right.
We're almost out of time. I just wonder, you took over after, you know, such a crazy time in our politics. You've had now nearly a year in the job. You must sometimes think about your predecessors, your former colleagues. Who's the better Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss?
Look, everyone has great strengths and everyone brings something different to the job. I'm not interested in the past, though. I'm interested in the future and what I can bring to the job. And that's what I think the country wants. And what you're going to get from me is someone who does what they believe is right for the long term of the country. I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm not going to focus on the short term. I'm going to focus on doing what I believe is right in the long term. That's the leadership that I'm going to bring. I spent the first year stabilising things, making progress on bringing inflation down, reducing the number of boat crossings that are coming, and now I'm going to set out a direction for our country that will lead us to a better place, but that involves doing things differently, that involves bringing change, but that's what I want to do. I want to bring the change, and that's what the country wants.
And you're clearly pitching yourself as a change candidate. The person who wants to, and believes he is the change candidate, of course, is Keir Starmer. Now, politics can be brutal, but it's not all rough and tumble, so I want to ask you, is there anything you admire about him? And I'll give it away, we're going to ask him that next week too.
Look, great. I'm not interested in talking about personalities. People can make up their own minds. I'm interested in setting out my vision for the country, and people can make their own judgment. But what I would say is that you've got to take a stand on things. You've got to take a stand on things. Right? I don't expect everyone to agree with me on everything, but people will have a clear idea of what I believe, what I stand for, and the direction in which I want to lead the country. I don't think actually saying nothing, hiding is the right type of leadership. I think that's an abdication of leadership, quite frankly. I'm interested in setting out a clear set of policies, a clear direction of travel based on my values, which I think are the values shared by the British people, and that's how we're going to do things now. Okay. We're going to do things differently, we're going to change how we do politics, and that's how we're going to change our country.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for coming and giving us your time this morning. I know conference is always a very packed week for party leaders, so we're grateful to you for being us this morning. Thank you so much. What did you reckon? You can chip in, of course, Kuenssberg at bbc.co.uk. Use the hashtag BBC Laura K, or you can follow the conversation on the BBC Live page. Right then, Fraser, what did you think?
This is a very different Rishi Sunak to the one we saw even a year ago. He's got an agenda in a more palpable way than he had even a few months ago. He was quite passionate. He wasn't very up for letting you interrupt him when he was giving his responses. And he almost welcomes the battle. He sees these corporate guys, the Malcolm Walker from Iceland, and he's thinking, bring it on. His position is, I am standing with the mainstream British public opinion. I'm defying the lobbyists who want these green targets. I'm going to take flak for it. so be it.
But he thinks it might be worth it. I mean, Louise, I saw there was a glorious eye roll that the cameras may or may not have captured right there. What did you think?
Well, glorious eye roll because, I mean, to be honest, within minutes of him talking about driving and being pro-drivers, the whole discussion unravelled because essentially my big concern about all this new Rishi is it's a rebrand so that, and I understand this, it's politics. He wants to be the Prime Minister and win the next election. And what we're seeing is somebody setting out things that they're saying are new and this and that and the other. That, the driving 20 mile an hour thing is fascinating because essentially, as you pointed out to him, every local authority in the country has the ability, if they want to vary that 20 mile an hour limit. Safety people would be very concerned about that. So you sort of within seconds or minutes of that questioning, it unravelled. And I suppose that's my fundamental concern here, is that, the country isn't creaking, it's actually broken. I mean, we are in Salford, we are in the middle of the northwest. There are numerous people that are using food banks more than ever before. The idea that they're on the side of working people, the vast majority of people who are now poor are working. So whatever's happening there is not working for those people. Thousands, millions of people haven't recovered from the pandemic. And I sometimes feel, and I know, I'm not a party conference person, I'm not political in a way. So, of course, I feel that all of this is totally out of touch with what's actually happening out there.
John, what do you think?
It's really rather fascinating to watch up close the non-answering of questions.
I did my best.
You did your best. You pitched there.
It's the non-answering of the question that then becomes the answer. HS2, for example, why not just say, we're thinking about it, we don't know yet, can't really tell you, rather than just...
Or actually we've changed our minds because we don't have the courage
perhaps there's an announcement, so that's my suspicion, it's an announcement they're going to make in a few days' time, in a few weeks' time, but not today.
Yeah, but then why did they spend the last few weeks briefing out about it the same way, it's not like he's in control of his cabinet, is he? God love him, he's got the Home Secretary out there live and uncut on all sorts of issues.
Well, you don't think that was with his endorsement?
Well, his endorsement came the next day. It might be with his endorsement, but it doesn't feel like they're in control. And some of the things they're saying are just fundamentally wrong. What the Home Secretary did, her intervention.
Look, you might disagree with it, but I think it suits him to have Suella Braverman out there saying this protects the Tories from a threat from their more right-wing parties. Right now,
Fraser, they've been in charge for 13 years, and for 13 years we've had an immigration problem. For 13 years we've had waiting lists. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what Wes Streeting says. There are, it went from the BBC saying there were 7.5 million people on waiting lists to this morning it said there are 7.7 million people on waiting lists. It just, all of this rings hollow. Sorry, I mean, I wish I could say I agree with some of what he said, but I just can't.
Fraser, what about, though, the control of the party? Because I think clearly, from your point of view, from the Telegraph, traditionally Conservative point of view, there is a much more generous opinion of Rishi Sunak now in the last week. He's definitely changed that lens in which some of the traditional Conservatives look at him. But is he really in control? Earlier this morning, Michael Gove did say there must be a tax cut before the next election. We have had Suella Braverman out. Perhaps the number sends full endorsement. Perhaps it's convenient for her to have her out in the right. But how would you really describe Rishi Sunak's position now inside the Conservative Party?
Well, this time last year, remember, the Tories came to their conference for the violence, pretty much. They're to tear apart Liz Truss. I mean, that was what you call out of control. Right now, you've got outriders. Suella Braverman going further than Sunak would like to use himself, but still, this suits him. Michael Gove talking about tax cuts. The Prime Minister would like some tax cuts. Again, this isn't unlicensed. So in the great scale of Tory wars, things are pretty mild right now.
But what about in terms, though, of getting out to, our viewers? People in the middle, people who haven't yet made up their minds, people who maybe voted Tory in 2019, they quite liked perhaps the 2019 manifesto, and then they see Rishi Sunak clearly say, if I have to ditch some of it, so be it, bring it on.
Well, that will be his mission right now. This new agenda of his is only a few weeks old. Now, you might argue it's perhaps too late. We're only a year away from the general election. Can he really change gear now and expect people to change the opinion of him that they've formed already? Because let's face it, it is pretty unlikely he's going to be the victor of the next election, not when most polls have got him 15, 17 points behind. So this is if you like, it's radical in a way, but in a way his positions are fairly centrist, aligning with the EU's target on banning car sales. This is not a radical policy. When he's attacked as if it is, this kind of suits him.
Yeah, interesting you say that. It does, of course, his leadership follow up in a completely incredible period in politics. And John, you've been really delving into this for your latest project, where you've made a docudrama, should we call it that, about what happened in Partygate when you play Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson, yes.
I just want to show the audience a little taste of what it's about.
I should add, I think this is probably the most unsocially distanced party in the country right now. I thank you for your morale and dedication, and long may it continue. Bravo.
Now, the voice, of course, there is you playing Boris Johnson. But what's this really about?
It's a docudrama based on the findings of the Sue Gray report and bringing it to visible, very stark viewing life. The programme maker, Joseph Bullman, is a great expert on making programmes of this type, and he and his team exhaustively went through the Sue Gray report, the 800 pages or more, and those accounts which had been reported in the Times and others, and just put together in a very visible, relatable way what happened through Partygate and the illegal parties, juxtaposed with those people out in the real world who were following the rules and who were really going through the most unthinkable hardships, juxtaposed with cut to the parties that were going on till 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, with altercations, spilt wine, people being sick, all of this sort of stuff. And it's just showing, making very viscerally visible the events of Partygate, according to the reports.
It does all seem still so fresh in the memory, doesn't it? I mean, Fraser, just briefly, do you think the Tories have got over the perception that created the public?
Oh no, very much. A lot of people broke faith with the Tories then and thought never again.
It was a moment, very interesting. OK, we'll be back with you guys at the end of the programme. Now, Dame Helen Mirren is no stranger to playing strong leaders, from Cleopatra to Catherine the Great, from Elizabeth I to Elizabeth II, for which, of course, she won an Oscar. Her latest role, though, is a stunning transformation in which Mirren plays the Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, during the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. When I was lucky enough to meet her, she began by telling me why she saw Golda Meir as a personal trailblazer back in the 70s.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Today, the Egyptian and Syrian armies launched an offensive against Israel. Our enemies hoped to surprise the citizens of Israel on Yom Kippur.
Our troops are outnumbered 7 to 1.
If the Arabs reach Tel Aviv, Israel will be wiped off the map. I was in my early 20s when Golda first became Prime Minister. And you're too young to remember this, Laura, but it was an astounding moment for young women, because up to that point, it was incomprehensible that a woman could lead a country, let alone a country as complex and as important as Israel. Just the fact she didn't put on power suits, and walk around like I'm running a country. On the contrary, she just stayed exactly who she was before she became Prime Minister. It was an incredibly important moment in female history, for me personally, to see that happen. It was a moment when you went, oh my God, it's possible. It's possible. Because until then, it wasn't possible.
Can you see why, though, sometimes some people in your industry, some audience members, feel uncomfortable about people playing characters? There was a huge row, for example, about Bradley Cooper playing Leonard Bernstein. Can you see why the criticism over what some people have called Jew face, can you see why that gets traction? Why some people are riled by it?
I think I can see, but sometimes I can't see, because I can't see who in this room is Jewish. We are all such an amazing mix. And certainly I don't have an issue with Kirk Douglas playing a Viking. Kirk Douglas was Jewish. I think the whole question of assuming a certain physiognomy because you're playing a particular race, there is something offensive about that. On the other hand, if you're playing Leonard Bernstein, and this is really what Leonard Bernstein looked like, you know, maybe it's a good idea. It's, as I said, it's a very delicate balance.
When taking on the role of Golda, were you aware, or how aware would you have been of her controversial side? So she said, you know, once there is no such thing as Palestinians. Many
of course,
people
she did have a Palestinian passport herself when she first went to Israel. She was a Palestinian.
But many people look at her and say actually some of her actions were unacceptable.
Yes, and I think that's true in the context of today's world, absolutely. We are all the product of the society that we grow up in and the world around us and our education and all the rest of it. So, yes, absolutely that's true.
But are you reconciled to that?
I don't need to be reconciled to that. I'm not, all I'm doing is playing Golda during the period of the Yom Kippur War, and that's what I'm doing. I'm not, you know, explaining her or rationalizing her or
justifying her,
reappraising her. You know, I'm just playing a woman of that age, dealing with that situation. When I was a child in Ukraine at Christmas time, my father would board up the windows of our house
Golda.
to protect us from Cossacks who would get drunk and attack Jews. They would beat Jews to death in the street for fun. My father would hide us in the cellar, and we'd stay silent, hoping the killers would pass us by. I am not that little girl hiding in the cellar.
You've played so many great roles, and whether it's, you know, through Prime Suspect, or we don't have to go through the list, but for many people, one of the really wonderful roles that you played, of course, was the Queen.
Mm.
Now, you cancelled everything earlier this year to go to the BAFTA tribute to her.
Cinema, at its best, does what Her Majesty did effortlessly. Bring us together and unite us in a story.
How did you feel when you heard that she had died? You had so many associations, not just playing her, but I know meeting her on several occasions.
I was away. I was abroad when she died, and I wanted more than anything to be in England, to be in Britain, I should say, to be right here in London. I wanted to be here in London with my fellow Londoners, mourning, you know, the loss. I'm an Elizabethan, you know. My first memory almost is doing a little pageant for the Queen being crowned. Literally my first memory. So my whole life and career and work and everything has been in the period of the Elizabethan, second Elizabethan era. So I've always called myself an Elizabethan in that sense. So it was a recognition of the end of my era in many ways. The end, not the end of my life, but the end of my, maybe seeing the end of my creative life, of my influence, you know, the end of my influence, if I've ever had any influence. But you know what I'm saying, you know, sort of realizing that I'm on that path as well. It was very multi-layered for me, losing the Queen.
And very personal.
And very personal, yes, very. Not because I'd played her. That was irrelevant. It was much more to do with my parents, that generation, the way in which she had done the job. It was much more to do with other things, really, than playing her, honestly.
Dame Helen, thank you so much
Thank you.
for sharing some of your stories with us today. And thank you so much for speaking to us today. Thank you.
The remarkable Dame Helen Mirren speaking to us earlier this week. Now, a while ago on the programme, it was pretty clear that Rishi Sunak is up for the fight. How will Labour punch back? Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, is with us here in Salford.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for coming in. Now, let's start with schools, because I just want to read you two things. Your boss, Keir Starmer, said, "We cannot justify continued charitable status for private schools. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, said, we will end that exemption where private schools are treated like charities. This week, though, all of a sudden, the Labour Party is not doing that anymore. How do you explain to our viewers why Labour keeps changing its mind?
Well, what matters is what works, and we don't think that against the backdrop of the serious challenges facing our country, the real pressures on family finances, not least because the tax burden is at its highest in 70 years, that when it comes to those hard choices, it's fair to give a tax exemption in VAT to private schools when that money could be better invested in the education of the 93%. And by the way, that's not just my view. It wasn't the Labour Party who said that it's not fair that we're subsidising the education of oligarchs. It was Michael Gove. The difference is he's had 13 years in the cabinet to sort this out and hasn't done anything. The Labour Party will tackle this so that we can invest in the education of the vast majority of kids who don't have a chance to go to private schools, so they have the same chances in life.
My question, though, is not about the taking VAT off. It's about the charitable status of these schools. Now, as we've explained to viewers this morning, it was the Labour policy to end the charitable status for private schools. You've now ditched that. So is that you going soft on private schools, or is it that you didn't understand the consequences of what that change might be?
No, we've looked carefully at what would work to achieve the goal that we want, which is to invest more in the education of the 93% of kids who are studying in our state schools, and to make sure that we're funding that in a fair way. And
so
we don't think that the subsidy to private schools is acceptable.
But had you not looked carefully then at what the impact of the charitable status change would be?
No, we're just looking at what would work most effectively and how we can make that difference as quickly as possible. And look, we are taking the job of making sure that at the next election we've got a manifesto that people can believe in, offering the real change our country needs and promises that we can keep, and looking at, in a very practical way, if we win the next general election, how can we make the most difference most quickly? And ending the VAT exemptions on private schools is an easy thing for an incoming Labour government to do.
This is important to our viewers because they've heard your leading politicians like you, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, say over the last few months, yes, we're going to stop private schools being charities, we are going to make that change. And now you're saying, oh, well, we've looked carefully at it now, we're not sure it's going to work, so we're not going to do it anymore. That's about people being able to trust what you say today, next week, the month, and in the run-up to the general election, and trust that you're going to do what you say. And here, in this particular instance, it suggests that you hadn't looked at it carefully enough, and now you're ditching it.
No, I think people can take reassurance from the fact that the promises we make in our manifesto at the election will be promises that we can keep.
But does that mean that anything that's not
we are bomb-proofing
yet
every single one of our policies, so we don't end up in the same position as the government, where you've got the Prime Minister out this morning talking about 20-mile-an-hour limits, but when pressed under scrutiny, couldn't explain a single difference this would make to anyone in any part of the country.
But that's an interesting point, though, you say there. Is this now the phase that Labour is in? You are bomb-proofing, to use your phrase, your plans before they get into the manifesto, because that suggests that other promises you've made before might also end up being chucked over the side. We've seen that already with the promises on student fees. We've seen that already with other things Keir Starmer has said in his leadership campaign a few years ago. Things have been chucked over the side, will not make it into the manifesto. So if you are in this process of bomb-proofing, can you be kind of honest about it and say to people, yeah, more of these things might disappear, even if it's for the right reasons, because you want to be absolutely sure that your plans are workable if you win?
Yeah, it's no bad thing that we are working really hard to make sure that there is a high bar to get into Labour's manifesto. And that bar is it credible? Can it be delivered? Will it make a real difference to people's lives? And that's how we formulate our manifesto. And that's how we'll be able to offer the real change our country needs.
So other things might go too?
Well, next week we'll have our party conference. These party conferences aren't just jamborees for the faithful. They're windows for the voters to look in at our two parties and make a judgment about who they trust to govern. And next week at Labour's conference, you will see a team and a platform and a plan to give Britain its future back, focused on the priorities of the country. In this week's, just look at today's newspapers. Biggest issue, the cost of living crisis. What's the Prime Minister saying? I want a tax cut for the 4%, which would save the Prime Minister personally £300 million. Instead of the NHS, we've got the HRC. And instead of clamping down on criminals, the Home Secretary's going after Elton John. What sort of priorities are these?
In the last few days, though, it's interesting because actually the Prime Minister has been able to capture some of the agenda. He has put forward some things that voters have noticed. And actually then what's happened to Labour in the last few weeks is you've ditched a plan that you had before. Are you worried that he might be a bit more punchy? He might be about to put quite a lot more pressure on your party?
I'm worried about two things. Firstly, that things are going to get worse for our country before the general election. And secondly, that with the Conservative Party, the worst is yet to come. Because you said at the top of the programme that, you know, I and the Labour Party is hoping to shove Rishi Sunak out of office. It's not just us, it's half of his cabinet. Look at today's newspapers. They are all jockeying for position, putting themselves forward with principles and policies that look further and further divorced from the priorities of the country.
But my question to you is about Labour being able to capture the agenda. And you've talked about how you need to bomb-proof existing policies before they're good enough to get into the manifesto. You've said that there will be more plans coming next week. Will one of those plans be a plan for social care, which, you know, I've asked you about this lots of times because our viewers care deeply about this. We've asked you repeatedly when there will be a complete plan for helping the system, which is creaking, that cares for the most elderly and vulnerable in this country. When will it come?
I'm going to try very hard not to torpedo next week's Labour conference announcements, but let me tell you, in terms of health and social care, and you cannot separate the two, they are absolutely crucial for the future of this country. We're going to have a serious 10-year plan for health and social care that makes sure we've got both an NHS that's fit for the future, but also a social care system that's worthy of the name.
So should we take from that then,
we will start with the workforce and the fact that we don't have people paid fairly enough, so we can't recruit and retain the care workers that we need. That's our number one priority. That's the most urgent task. But what we need is a serious long-term plan, and that's what Labour will deliver.
And should we take from that might be something that you set out at next week's Labour conference?
Well, you have to wait and see, Laura. I will see you
hang
at
on, you
conference.
mentioned it. You
have to wait and see next week. But what I can tell you is that next week's Labour conference, when people look through the window into the Labour Party, they will see a Labour Party that's focused on the priorities of the country, that wants to give Britain its future back, and isn't going to be tinkering around the edges in the way that the Prime Minister was this morning. Because I thought, you know, actually speaking as a motorist, I thought, you know, the biggest issue facing me at the moment isn't the fact that, you know, my local council won't let me speed past the primary school and during the school run. It's the fact that if I go to the petrol pumps, I'm paying at least £1.50 a litre, and that is on a good day. So I'd just say to the Prime Minister, with the time you've got left in office, why don't you genuinely make the right long-term decisions for the country instead of throwing in chaos and uncertainty in the way that he has on HS2,
but it's been good to you to talk about, good to talk to you about Labour's decisions this morning, and thank you for being here in front of the windows of amazing Salford and the canals of this part of the country, West Streeting. Thanks very much indeed for being here. So, now then, Louise, I know you've said you're probably going to back Keir Starmer, but you've also said repeatedly Labour has to come forward with bigger, bolder plans. What did you think of what Wes had to say?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I was sitting here this morning thinking, thank God we've got Laura Kuenssberg doing this programme, because at least you ask people straight questions. What you're looking for is some straight answers. And to be blunt, until we get straight answers from both the opposition and the Prime Minister, it's very hard for us to know who to vote for and where to go. Of course I want a change of government. This lot are done, they're spent. You know, there isn't anything that makes me think that we should vote for them again. And I have hope that Keir Starmer stands for something and will answer a straight question and is honest and has integrity.
But Fraser, do you think, though, Labour will feel a bit more pressure because Rishi Sunak is coming out more punchy?
Yes, it will, but I don't think it will respond to it. They're doing very well now by basically playing a defensive game, stonewalling questions like the ones you were asking, and look at where they are ahead in the polls. To simply stay that way from now until the election will mean a landslide majority. So that's why the language is so cautious.
Remember, though, politics can change like the wind, but it's going to be such a fascinating period, and maybe quite a weird one too. Politics can be pretty weird after all. But there was no story stranger than this in the last week. There was horror when a tree was chopped down, but not just any tree, the sycamore in Northumberland National Park that was made famous by countless photographs and by the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. 2 people have been arrested for the felling, but one of the stars of that film, Brian Blessed, who played Robin Hood's father, Lord Locksley, he took losing the tree as a personal blow.
Well, I mean, like everybody else, sheer horror. I was president of the national parks for 7 years. That tree's about 2,000 years old. Well, I was always going there on my bike and then carrying my bike over the moors. And that was a wonderful sycamore tree. Sycamores are wonderful with their big leaves. And to hear that someone's cut it down, it's beyond comprehension. And people have gone there, and it's brought joy to them. You know, they've left their ashes there when they've died, and they got married there. All kinds of lovely events have taken place. The tree is deeply honoured. I'm absolutely heartbroken about the whole damn thing. And of course, added to all that, you might say it's Lord Locksley's estate, because I was Lord Locksley, Robin Hood's father, Kevin Costner's farmer. How the hell I was his father? A kind of Yorkshire.
What would make it better? Should another tree be planted alongside?
I'd plant another sycamore, because they're very big trees, and let the present tree grow its stumps. What I would, it will start shooting up. It's not dead. It will survive, and it will be very bushy. But and then give it company and plant another tree a good 200 yards away or 300 yards away. To keep it, it will talk to it. It will help it.
Well, the campaign for a second tree started today by Brian Blessed. John, I'm going to put you through your paces and ask you to give us some impressions in a second. But first of all, that's a pretty weird story, isn't it? What did you think when you saw that news?
Dear, just a crass, punishingly depressing act. Why do that? What sort of empty soul does that? One positive thing that I did read, and Brian alluded to it there, that this tree will survive, it will regrow, that the stumps will, and the sprouts will come. In 5 years' time, they could be 30 feet tall, and that act of vandalism may have inadvertently prolonged the life of the tree.
Oh, there you go.
So we must
well,
take
that is one positive, and now we're going to ask you to give us some light relief. So in no particular order, can you give us an impression of the wonderful Brian Blessed?
Well, he was talking about talking to the plants. If he talks to the tree, it should be back whoosh. Let us hope so.
And
yes, he was rather gentle there, wasn't he?
And we've all heard your Boris Johnson impression on many occasions, so we've just got time to hear your Rishi Sunak impression, if there is one. And maybe Keir Starmer, if we can squeeze it in.
The way to get to Rishi, start at Tony Blair and sort of make it a little bit more syrupy, a little bit more relaxed. Let me push through my prepared statements. Rishi Sunak, the closest you can get to AI while still remaining human. And you're right, Laura. Yes, you're right. You're right to say that, and you're right. And let me do the more prepared bit. No, I'm not going to stop yet. And don't ask another question. I'm keeping talking so you can ask less things.
And a sentence of Keir Starmer?
Well, that would be more hesitant and would be in instalments and in this sort of way. And now it's time for songs of praise.
Well, the real Keir Starmer will be with us on the show next week, but we've had a teaser of what John thinks he might sound like when he's actually in the chair. But John, thank you very much for giving us some light relief after some pretty heavy conversations this morning. But it's been wonderful to have the three of you with us this morning. And if you've stopped marvelling at John's impressions, let me remind you of our main question this morning. With the government ditching some of its old positions, we are seeing a different Rishi Sunak trying to grab back your support. And we had a good long chance to ask the man himself what he really stands for.
I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do what I believe is right. I get that people will be critical of that. I'm okay with that. I'm going to be guided by what I believe is right. I believe that what I'm doing is right for the British people.
After many months lagging behind in the polls, the Prime Minister does want you to think he's a different leader, pitching himself as the man who wants to shake up the status quo and has the smarts to do it. But with a fractious party, a grumpy public, and after 13 years of the Tories in charge, it might take the might of a political superhero to pull it off. But after this conference season, Mr Sunak can't be accused anymore of having nothing to say. Next week, of course, the show will be in Liverpool with his arch rival, Keir Starmer, not John Coleshaw. You can join me and Paddy on BBC Sounds a bit later with the weekend newscast. Catch up on anything you missed on iPlayer. Or, of course, we'll be back on BBC One next Sunday. Same time, different place in Liverpool. But goodbye for now.
Someone pay me a $5, I'll go down there and throw a fucking at it. Cunt. Oh, what a shitty show. Fucking I hate Laura Kuenssberg. She's such a fucking shit host. What was that woman's name who was on last week? She had cancer, apparently, one time. I forgot her fucking name. Anyway, she's a much better interviewer. Much better, in my opinion. I fucking knows why Laura Kuenssberg got this job. She's shite. Apparently the ratings are fell off a fucking cliff since she's been hosting this new Andrew Marr show. / not Andrew Marr show. Anywho, still getting over the tragedy of yesterday. Fucking football. Fuck it up. Anywho, see you all Monday. Maybe. Should be. Ta-ra.